Now, I come to this as a sociologist of work, interested in new and not so new forms of calibration, as Sarah Sharma puts it, of workers' bodies in space and time. If I think of the world of finance, how traders must align themselves to global patterns of exchange, keep watch over the operation of their deals and their algorithms. In the platform or gig economies, we have workers who must work long hours and make themselves available at unsocial or irregular times to meet the needs of clients in different time zones. So to my mind, these phenomena make the reconsideration of rhythm politically and intellectually urgent. However, what my interest is in the talk today is that if we recognise that attention to rhythm matters, the cultivation of research practices and capacities that can grasp rhythm is especially important. And I want to focus on ways of doing rhythm analysis. I take my lead from French philosopher, urban critic, sociologist, and literary critic Henri Lefebvre, and his collaborator and one of his wives, Catherine Régulier, for whom rhythm is as a means, or rhythm analysis is a means of critiquing everyday life as well as an embodied and sensory research practice. And I can already anticipate some of the questions that may follow. I wasn't quite sure how much to say about rhythm analysis. It sounds to me like this audience is scarily knowledgeable already. But just for anybody that has come today who's new to this, rhythm analysis, this short book here, is considered to be Lefebvre's fourth and final volume of his 3-volume critique of everyday life. And it's attracted considerable interest, notably within geography, to study mobility, place, work, nature, consumption and leisure, education, identity. And it's also credited with giving Lefebvre something of an afterlife, as Stuart Eldon puts it, as his popularity in the Anglo-American Academy has spiralled, if not in France and in the Francophone world, which is an interesting conversation in itself. So for Lefebvre, rhythm is always spatial and temporal and offers a means of grasping space and time together. That remains its strength and appeal. It calls attention to the ways in which places and activities might be characterised by the ensemble of rhythms that permeate them, as Tim Edensaw, who's done a lot of work in popularising and practising rhythm analysis, comments. So it's an object and a tool of analysis to show how change occurs through the imprinting of new rhythms on an era. So Lefebvre fundamentally is concerned with capitalism's colonisation of different spheres of life, its invasiveness into routine practices, which result in more abstract and linear forms of space and time that structure everyday experience. He contrasts linearity. First of all, he calls it linear time. Later, he calls it linear rhythms, which I think is a little bit confusing. But he contrasts the linearity of technology, industry, the city, with the cyclical rhythms of nature, which refers also to his own experience growing up in the southwest of France, that are apparent in the seasons, practices of rural life. This is a rather reductive, nostalgic, possibly even moralistic opposition, as Briganti and Carholm point out. And it's not especially helpful if we take it literally, but it does offer a vocabulary of rhythm whose relations we can explore today in more nuanced ways. There's actually been debate over the status of his rhythm analytical project. Some comment that the rhythm analysis stops short of being a method or a methodology. It's an orientation, an investigative disposition, a suggestive vein, a speculative invitation. I would suggest that a close reading of rhythm analysis does offer real inspiration and direction for researching with rhythm. And I spent this book saying that you may wish to have a look at. What I'm going to do today is talk about the ways in which I've tried to operationalise rhythm analysis in an original ethnographic research project into the spatial and temporal unfolding of London's Billingsgate fish market. Whilst rhythm is pervasive to the life of the market and you don't have to be there for long to feel it, its intangibility actually makes it quite difficult to research. And I'm interested in that. Rhythms, Lefebvre bemoans, they reveal and they hide. So how can we grasp rhythms and how can we be grasped by them? So I start with the body and learning to feel rhythm. So Lefebvre advocated rhythm analysis as an immersive phenomenological practice, and that's often how it's been widely used, although of course there's important historical cultural analysis too. But the rhythm analyst listens first to he's sexist in his language, to his body. He learns rhythm from it in order to consequently appreciate external rhythms. The rhythm analyst might then take her own rhythms as a reference, such that the body serves as a metronome in relation to broader patterns and interactions. The rhythm analysis, again, Lefebvre's words, thinks with his body not in the abstract but in lived temporality. To grasp a rhythm, it's necessary to have been grasped by it. One must let oneself go, give oneself over, abandon oneself to its duration. So when I first spent time in the fish market, I tried to do that, feel the way that rhythm permeated my own body. But I noticed my movements were quite staccato. I quite literally didn't know where to place myself. There's no discrete position from which to stand or observe, and the market itself is constantly on the move. So I was out of step, experiencing very clearly moments of arrhythmia, lacking the spatial confidence, as Louise Nash puts it in her work on city workers in London, the spatial confidence of the insider. So Billingsgate, for those of you that don't know, is an important wholesale fish market in London, although it's also open to the public, but it serves mostly hotel and the hotel and catering trade, fishmongers and other consumers. It opens for trade at 4 a.m, but buyers can browse beforehand, and the market closes at around 8. But there's work to be done still after that. So for me, just the experience of calibrating my own body to the rhythms of the market was instructive to start with, getting up very early, driving across East London, and trying to mirror the patterns that the workers there themselves experienced. And Ben Snyder, on his brilliant work on the disruptive workplace and flexible capitalism, documents something similar in his ethnography of truck drivers. And he mirrored their sleeping and waking patterns to feel for himself the rhythms of those workers. So if I mostly started to get a sense of the rhythms of everyday market work through being out of sync and out of place, this disjuncture was instructive, and it revealed to me how fluid the rhythms were that underpinned the embodied skill and knowledge of the fish merchants and people who worked in the market. Lefebvre and Régulier argue that we become aware of our own rhythms when we suffer from some irregularity or disorderliness. So disruption offers a heuristic device for doing research into rhythm. Other scholars, Tim Edensaw with Caitlin Bowder, for example, have gone deliberately against the grain of the way that life is unfolding in public space in order to detect rhythms. And Caitlin Bowder in particular used dance in a Manchester park to really unsettle the everyday patterning of life there. So it took me some time to literally absorb the rhythms of market life, knowing when to move and bend to its activity. And that's what Lefebvre calls dressage, literally the entrainment and constitution of the body through rhythm and the production of rhythm through corporeal gestures. I then was able to use this process explicitly. So I sought to match my stride to porters, shadowing them on their way to take orders to a waiting van. So I registered rhythm at this kinesthetic level in relation to my usual pattern and pace. And this was also this kind of following, trying to track individual or singular rhythms, was helpful to disentangle rhythms of the elements rather of the polyrhythmic assemblage of Billingsgate and come to appreciate how different rhythms combine to produce synchronization and the spatio-temporal entanglements of the market. I also paid attention to looking and listening, both with my own eyes and ears and with different kinds of recording devices. First, I didn't, although I was interested in the kind of rhythmic assemblage of the market as a whole, I wanted to hear the ways in which fish merchants themselves talked about rhythm, even if they didn't talk about it directly in those terms. This is kind of reading oral material through the lens of rhythm. People reported feeling in tune and in sync with one another and with the life of the market, but the other side of that was they felt very out of sync with the outside world, and the temporality of the market would suggest that. They discussed implications for family life, lots of discord and divorce. And one young fish merchant, for example, Ryan, says he stays up in the afternoon. Some colleagues go home and go straight to bed so that him and his wife can go out and have lunch or something like that after his work. So she has to calibrate her life to his. Then he goes to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening, which means we don't go out in the evenings, he says. I don't anyway, which makes it a bit difficult at times. And there are lots of instances of those sorts of tensions. The discussions also revealed how the traders' work is characterised by different combinations of rhythm. They plan in terms of seasons and holidays, they manage the vagaries of the weather and regulation and their implications for supply. So Roger, a very well-known Billingsgate trader, says, I'm on call 24 hours a day and I'm dependent on the weather. But he plays with this knowledge. He plots ahead and anticipates who will buy what, constituting future preferences in how he makes a sale. And then at the everyday, you've got the patterning and the rhythms of the exchanges that happen in the space of that day's market that nevertheless relate to past deals and ongoing relationships, as well, of course, fundamentally, the availability of the fish itself. In addition to listening to those accounts, I also paid attention to the soundscape of the market. And that's a vital part of sensing rhythm, because as you walk into the rhythm, the sonic dominance, as Henriques puts it, is really quite consuming. And it takes a while to disentangle different layers of sound, which is actually helped by the recording device that works more effectively than that, than the human ear. So we get the close ring of a telephone, someone shouting nearby, the pervasive squeak of polystyrene boxes. Now, Lefebvre is particularly interested in the attentive ear. He instructs the rhythm analysis to listen to the world, to what are called noises, to murmurs, full of meaning, and to silences. And he recognises the benefits of sound recording. He says it allows us to put on disc or cassette and reflect on rhythms which no longer vanish as they appear. So it's a useful device for us. And I think at the moment, at the present time, sonic methods seem to be gaining ground as a sensory approach and also as an important counter to the dominance of the visual in urban experience. I looked a lot with the camera, as you can see, as well as the everyday observations with my eyes, and tried to figure out in what ways I could see different kinds of things. The photographs turned out, however, not to be as effective as I hoped for sensing rhythm. They show the work of display, the way that each stand presents samples, but and I could see this process happening in real time, the way that the fish was aestheticized and staged for exchange. But my photos kind of just kept repeating the same, an interesting rhythm in itself, just repeatedly collecting the same kind of image. And in the end, I tried a little bit with collage to see if I could animate them more in that way. But in the end, I gave up altogether. What did happen is that I got ideas for different audiovisual forms. So despite the gains of moving around the space at Billingsgate, deploying the senses as research tactics, what if immersion and close attention are actually obstacles to the perception of ebb and flow of the market? I had this sense of failing to grasp the market, and this presented itself in the form of a bodily gesture that as I walked around the market, I kept looking over my shoulder. It was as if it was happening somewhere else. That sense of it coming to life behind my back and moving away too quickly to take it in. So I was interested in how we can deal with this sensory excess when my body was insufficient to capture the the rhythm of the market. Now, Lefebvre talks about the marvellous invention of a balcony, and he positions himself in space in Paris, where he lives on the Rue Rambuteau for 30 years, and describes in the third chapter of Rhythmanalysis, the centrepiece of the book, arguably, seen from the window, how, in contrast to those who are caught up on the street, from the window, noises distinguish themselves, the flows separate out, and rhythms respond to one another. He actually says that no camera image or series of images can capture these rhythms, and whilst I think he was right in relation to my photographs, there are other tools that I would argue chime, that we can use today, that chime with the spirit of what he wanted us to do, where we can use sensory and audiovisual tools in sensitive ways. So together with filmmaker Kevin Reynolds, we spent time at the market and taking photographs from setup to close. This is just on a single night, from 1 o'clock in the morning until midday. Following Paul Simpson, we used time lapse as an opportunity to record the qualitative unfolding of the market and how the rhythms interfere and interrelate. I also did some sound walking so that the resultant montage could give a sense of that immersion in the space of the market, with the film speeded up so that you see 30 seconds in 1 hour. That's the signal that fish are allowed to leave the market. Feel free to watch the rest online. Just a few words to finish then. Although the construction of the montage is explicitly artificial, it's effective for revealing rhythm and showing the polyrhythmic complexity of the market. So we lose the richness of live live detail when we're actually immersed in the market, or real-time video, and we get the kind of juxtaposition of the linear time shown by the clock at the top of the frame, and the sequential processes of a series of things, one thing happening after another, but alongside the cyclical unfolding of the life of the market. And we see these different threads: recursive loops, repetition, rupture, resumption. So there's always an emergent interaction of the linear and the cyclical, rather than it being a question of one or the other, with sound connecting the viewers to the felt experiential aspects of market life. We get both a sense of eurythmic flow and arrhythmic disjuncture. I just want to say one more word about the limitations of something like this. I fully recognise that this kind of focus on the market hall makes it seem as if that's where all the trade is happening, and that's a problem of the kind of immediacy of ethnographic work that focuses on the here and now, which of course needs complementing with what's happening elsewhere at other times. And there's much more to be said about the fish trade than purely what happens at Billingsgate, and if the ESRC or Leverhulme ever give me the money, then I will tell you the rest of the story. Thank you very much. Thank you.
questions, comments, please, Michel?
Thank you very much. I saw the video earlier online and it was fascinating the first time I found it. I was wondering, how do you connect this ethnographic work that you have done? I mean, what emerged in terms of knowledge from this work about the rhythms of this specific social environment? And how do you connect, in a way to connect with the question earlier about the kind of vision that Lefebvre had in terms of critical perspective on society? How do you connect that kind of field work with this larger vision?
Mm-hmm. So, as I said when I introduced it, I came to this as a sociologist of work. So I'm interested in understanding the articulation of different forms of work in relation to one another and how they unfold in space and time. So from that point of view, I gain new knowledge about work, that the film is one means of tracing those connections, but so were the interviews and so were my own observations and the other forms of observation and recording I did. So it doesn't stand alone, it very much emerges out of a whole suite of methods, really. But I wanted to do more than I felt able to capture in single interviews, or the series of single interviews, in terms of how people give accounts of their individual lives that are embedded in a collective space and community, but don't necessarily speak to that. So the film became an important means of actually showing the connections of working lives, and then showing that back to the people whom I'd spoken to in interviews and getting their reactions to it. So it kind of had its own trajectory. In terms of the critical perspectives, I feel that I was anticipating that and sitting thinking what I might say to this, and I feel that, you know, one of the things I'm trying to reveal is the ways in which this kind of work takes place, and with what kinds of effects, so what that does to people. So it's an opportunity to have a critical perspective from a sociology of work perspective that might not speak in its immediacy to the kind of larger macro or theoretical questions. But certainly, if I was able to do the rest of the project, so some of you may have seen a piece of work I did with Les Back prior to this at Deptford Market, a retail setting. So my plan was to kind of go from the retail back to, to go from the plate back to the sea. And I've done a little bit of thinking about restaurant work and consumption, the retail setting, the wholesale setting. And I think if I was able to complete that project, that would give me an opportunity to use rhythm analysis in a much more ambitious way.
Tom?
Yeah, thank you for that. It was really illuminating. Can I ask a question? Perhaps one critique of Lefebvre would be that he sees capitalism as a place of life, whereas in fact the example you were looking at is capitalism as a place of life, but also as a necronic place, a place of death. And is it coincidental or is it accidental that you were looking at the kind of deceased fish, dead fish? How is that linked to a kind of extinction type emergent argument around the rhythms of extinction?
That's a fantastic question, thank you for that. Dead fish, it turns out, is not a singular category. So fish can be stiff alive at the market, which means they're still in rigour. And the language around which fish are talked about is incredibly nuanced. It's like any world of work you go into, you discover a whole repertoire of ways of sense making. So the fish is only finally dead when the fish inspectors condemn it and declare it to have no value and not be fit for human consumption. But then not even then is it quite dead, because it might be used to feed the local cats, it might be used to feed other fish as it's thrown back into the docks, some of it on the quiet. Formally, it's removed from Billingsgate and incinerated, but I suspect there are some other trajectories too. So I think that there is another project to be done there about situating the fish in a much bigger kind of global ecology paradigm. But from my point of view, my interest was also, and perhaps something I didn't make make much of here was also, what do the fish do in this kind of situation? So what do they do in terms of the trade and the production of value in those moments? So how are they acting to produce value for the fish merchant, or to cause enormous anxiety as they're perishing before everybody's eyes and not being sold? And then there's an important rhythm there, as the fish don't respect the timing of the market. So the market shuts, and that means that the fish is 1 day older immediately. And the fish just continues to perish at its own rate, which is slowed by care, by ice, and there's a lot to be said about how the fish merchants care for the fish. So my interest in terms of taking the fish seriously as actors and as present in the situation was more in those directions.
Well,
yeah, just a quick one. It's kind of a combination of comment, because the work I've done with Fadia was involved time lapse, so I was really interested in what you've done. What I loved about what you just, I love the way you're connecting this, and you're talking about methodology and the challenges of it to, you know, broader concerns around what's happening in terms of capital, neoliberalism, and the way our lives are patterned and shaped by those things. What I loved about that was I was watching the colours of the outfits, because you've got the, are they called fishmongers?
No, fish merchants.
So the merchants in white. Then these shadowy forms suddenly arrive and they're clearing up, aren't they?
Yeah.
So that there's clearly, it's highly organised and structured, and presumably there's a hierarchy of roles within it as well. Did people move up between those, or are they insulated? Is the classification quite rigid? So
actually, first to say something about colour, I think that's also something that audiovisual work just offers so much. So in the written article that goes with the film published in Sociological Research Online, I talk quite a lot about colour and how what you see in the early part of the night with lots of white and lots of polystyrene, then the fish themselves get shown and they gleam. You see yellow and green, the red of the floor later. It's replaced by blue with the rubbish bins and the clothing of the different buyers that are in the space. So even just that kind of sensory attention to colour gives you a way into thinking about what's the interconnections between the different things that are happening in the market. No, I've forgotten the other part of your question.
What I was interested in, though, they look like they were...
Oh yeah, the different types of roles, sorry. Yes. So there's, to my knowledge, there wasn't much movement between people doing cleaning jobs and employed by Billingsgate itself. The City of London Corporation owns Billingsgate, and doing that kind of work and actually moving into the fish trade. But within the fish trade, there's a lot of longevity. So there are people at the market who've been there for more than 50 years, and I've written elsewhere about placemaking and memory.
Families, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So the guys that you could see here, on this stall, they're two young guys, and their father is the one that's sitting in the office on the first floor that you can see the light flick on and off. And he's passed the actual the groundwork of trade to them, but he does the accounts and some of the follow-up work in the office. So it's very common that there are those family transitions. It's also common that you've got the fish merchant who owns the stand, and then their stalls, they call them stands, and then you've got salespeople that work for them, and sometimes those salespeople who've worked there for a long time get the opportunity to buy the business if the fish merchant wants to sell. They're not always in a position to buy the business. So certainly some of the people you see are salespeople, that is mostly male-dominated, salespeople that have been there for decades working for one or sometimes more than one employer. And there's a little bit of mobility between different markets, from Smithfield, the meat market, to here. And interestingly, between other forms of trade. So there's one guy who works on one of the frozen counters who was a city trader, and he had fantastic reflections about class in relation to the stance of the city traders. This is at Canary Wharf. So you have people from Canary Wharf, bankers and finance specialists who come to the market and think they're the ones that know how to do a deal. And actually you've got some very prosperous fish merchants who are much more savvy than they might be when it comes to fish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You will be able to take on more questions, perhaps, coffee break. May I ask you to reconvene here in